Hello and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare Poppies with Kamikaze. This video will show you how to compare the two poems effectively. There's lots of videos that will do a really good job of analysing each poem in isolation, which is important, but that is only step one. Step two is to compare the two poems, which means to write about their similarities and their differences. That is what the examiner wants. Now you can compare Poppies or Kamikaze with whatever poem you want. These poems were never meant to be compared. But as the question we're going to see is all about loss and a strong affection for the past, I can imagine writing an essay where I compare it to each other. Okay, so let's pretend that you've opened up the exam paper and what is at the top here is the question that you've got. How is the power of loss portrayed in Poppies and one other poem? And for today, let's compare it to Kamikaze. So what I've got here are two, what I hope are good, useful sentence starters with evidence to support each one. So sentence starter number one, both poems make effective use of structure to convey how loss is rawer when it is a family member, how the loss of somebody is a lot more emotional and upsetting when it happens to be a family member. This is not the strongest paragraph, but by the end of this video, we're going to go through 4 in total. So maybe there's something here that you can imagine writing with, or might be surely something that you could perhaps integrate into an introduction of sorts. So what's my evidence? Well, I'd go on to say that Poppies supports this topic sentence by talking about the segue of enjambment. What on earth do I mean by that? Well, I'm not talking about segways that you might have done when you're on holiday, those large sort of mechanised contraptions that you stand up on and zip you all over the place. The word segue actually means to subtly blend from one state to another. And we have that running all the way through Poppies, where we have him very much characterised, the son characterised as very much a young boy at the beginning. We hear how on line 4 she pinned Poppies to the lapel. Line 9 she smoothed down the collar. This sounds very much like a young boy being prepared for school. Before we know it though, line 15, she runs my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. And at this point, without her realising it, he's rather segued into a sort of teenager, somebody who has put a lot of hair gel in, which you won't necessarily do if you're a young schoolboy, but you might do as you get older. And when we hear in line 22 that he was away intoxicated, this adjective intoxicated may remind us of drinking alcohol. And where I'm going with all of this, everybody, is that her perception of her son is of somebody who has grown up very, very quickly without her necessarily realising, catching her unawares that her son has grown up far more quickly without her comprehending every single moment. He's sort of segued from childhood to adulthood. And the enjambment of the poem nicely complements that idea of somebody or something slowly changing, slowly metastasizing from one state to another without us necessarily realising. And that gives it the poem a certain amount of pathos, a certain amount of sorrow, a certain amount of sadness that the childhood version of her son no longer exists and has grown up rather more quickly without her realising. So that's one thing that I'd say about the structure of Poppies, that there's a slow, gradual segue of enjambment, talking about a family member. I'd say this is in complete contrast to Kamikaze. In Kamikaze, we don't get a slow, gradual segue of going from one state to another. We get instead, line 30, a sudden structural shift of a full stop that then goes into italics. What do I mean by this, everybody? Well, we do have some enjambment in Kamikaze. Indeed, we have a 30-line long sentence from line 1 to line 30. The first full stop of the poem does not occur until line 30. And it's at that point you get a sudden ending to the enjambment. in a way that you don't in Poppies, where it just gradually drifts on. And that sudden stop then immediately turns the penultimate and final stanza, almost, to italics. We get a very sudden, sharp structural shift from one state to another. There's a definite dividing line, there's a definite pivot point to the poem where it immediately, very much making us aware of this, changes from one state to another. And so hopefully you see that's a subtle difference there that I would hope you could try and flesh a paragraph out with. Paragraph 2, I'm talking about the topic of time, the power of time, something that we see reoccur through all of these poems, and as such, something that surely you may be able to write a good paragraph about comparing two poems with regards to. And what is my evidence for topic sentence number 2, where I'm going to suggest that loss, so repeating the key word of the question, loss of a simpler, more idealised time with a close family member is explored? Well, very simply, I'm going to talk about how at the beginning of Poppies we have that childlike innocence that I slightly touched upon in paragraph 1, but it's okay. I'm going to talk about slightly different things in paragraph 2. So that's certainly acceptable. In paragraph 1, we have this real sense of childhood innocence. There's a lot of examples one could talk about. The idea of the white cat hairs in line 8 being stuck to his school blazer. The idea of the mother, smoothing down the shirt's upturned collar. There's a gentleness to that. There is a nice sense of care and affection to that verb smoothed. But the one that I just want to really talk about is one that I'm sure we've all talked about in class, is the way that they would play at being Eskimos, like we did when you were little, when they would clearly rub their noses together. Everybody, you could just analyse that phrase and say that this phrase just has connotations of closeness, of tenderness, of a very strong affection that a mother may sort of only really do with their child when they are especially young. And this idealised childhood innocence, without us being aware, because of this drifting enjambment, because of this gentle segue that takes us on a path without us necessarily noticing, is corrupted or is certainly in huge contrast to the end, when we find that the speaker of the poem is skirting the churchyard walls. Clearly, the churchyard walls are a place where there are graves. As we find out in the final lines, she leans against a war memorial. So she comes, I'm sorry to say, to a place of death, to a place of remembrance, to a place of grand religious significance. And that is what I'm suggesting makes this raw, makes this upsetting, this loss. She's gone from one state of childhood innocence at the beginning of the poem, but concludes it in a far more weightier place of greater finality and significance. And this transition from an idealised world to a certainly less pleasant, more realistic world, I suppose one would say, again, we see a similar thing in Kamikaze, I'm suggesting. Certainly in the first 3 stanzas, we get a great deal of bright, vivid imagery. And I think you can say with much conviction that that bright, vivid imagery has a childish, idealistic, as close to perfect and vibrant and beautiful environment as one could hope to wish for. We hear, for example, about the green-blue translucent sea in line 12. You would analyse the effects of green-blue. It is bright, it is vivid. We hear about line 17, the flashing silver of the fish. And indeed, we also hear of bunting. Okay, so bunting is not necessarily bright, colourful imagery, but generally speaking, bunting is almost always bright and vivid, and it is to do with a childish time of celebration. We may choose to put bunting up at children's birthdays, for example. But just like in Poppies, where we started off with this idealistic, perhaps you may argue childlike, perhaps not necessarily childish, but childlike collection of imagery. So too, just like in Poppies, also in Kamikaze, we end up with a metaphorical death of the father. We hear how in the final line he had wondered what was the better way to die, because he dies metaphorically in the eyes of society. We also have, but I'm going to talk about this a bit later, the arrival in line 30 with that sudden enjambment break of the tuna, who is muscular and dangerous. A tuna, I'm sorry to say, is not the most attractive of fishes, and perhaps this intrusion of an unpleasant, less attractive fish than all of the bright, colourful fish that we hear of in the rest of that particular stanza suggests a sudden intrusion of an unpleasant, brutal reality. So that, I hope, is a really good paragraph that ultimately talks about how both poems explore the loss of a simpler, more idealised, childlike time that then comes, by the end of the poem, into a world that is far more bleaker, nastier, and more weighty and significant and final. Two more paragraphs to talk through. Slightly repetitive in my third paragraph, but this is a perfect reminder of if there are bits and bobs that you gel with, if there are bits and bobs that you can imagine writing about, but there are some equally parts that you can't imagine writing about, then that is okay, of course, and hopefully what we're doing here is showing you another way of using the same evidence for a point that you might feel is a little more accessible. So topic sentence number 3, paragraph number 3 would talk about how the power of loss is perhaps more effective when we consider the initial enthusiasm of the male character. So all I'm doing here, everybody, is noticing the fact that both poems have male characters who are at the beginning very enthusiastic about what they're doing, and this in itself perhaps makes the eventual loss all the more upsetting. We hear in Poppies about the gelled blackthorns. So on one hand, gelled blackthorns of hair suggest he's taking real pride in his appearance and wanting to appear as somebody who has a very pronounced and dynamic appearance towards the world. He has a sort of spiky excitement about him. But on the other hand, the blackthorns, everybody, may remind us of the crown of thorns that Jesus Christ was told to wear. And this initial enthusiasm is only going, surely, or perhaps indeed foreshadows, the eventual sacrifice that he has to make in the form of his death, which is heavily implied as what happens by the end of the poem. We return as well to that adjective intoxicated, when the door is opened and you were away, intoxicated. Now, on one hand, intoxicated is an adjective that can mean that somebody is literally consumed, as it were, by toxins or has consumed toxins, normally alcohol. But I think it's a fair point to say that, on the other hand, this adjective also implies that he is intoxicated by emotion. He is intoxicated by excitement. And therefore, again, that surely only makes the eventual loss of this character by his death in the war zone surely all the more upsetting. This adjective is sadly only going to make his eventual death all the more upsetting. He was so excited about going away. So the fact that he doesn't come back only makes this adjective all the more invested in pathos. And I think we've got a similar sort of beginning to Kamikaze, which also starts off with the idea of an enthusiastic male character, where we hear in line head that he has a shaven head. Okay, so the person in Poppies had gelled blackthorns. This is somebody who is really trying to assert his masculinity. He's shaving his head. A shaven head very often has associations or connotations with a strong masculine presence. We hear that this head is full of powerful incantations. Incantations are verses, are chants. To perhaps put it as crudely as possible, his head has perhaps been his mind has perhaps been affected by what we may call, some of us may call, excuse me, propaganda. And he has, in fact, been heavily swayed, shall we say, by very strong messaging that it is a right thing to go and die in the war. And we also have this semantic field of patriotism running through it, everybody. Line 1, the reference to sunrise, may remind the reader of the Japanese flag. Line 2, we have a reference to a samurai sword. Line 11, we have the simile of the fishing boats strung out like bunting. Line 14, we have a huge flag. All of these things one may associate with patriotism, but again, let's be really clever. So, okay, on one hand, that really does show the initial enthusiasm of the male character, but we notice that these fishing boats are strung out like bunting. The use of the phrase strung out implies fragility, that they could at some point break. And indeed, the fact that the huge flag that we referred to is waving in line 15. Sorry, I should say that the fish are like a huge flag, but they're going in a figure of 8. And on one hand, this flag may remind us of patriotism, but on the other hand, one waves a flag to surrender. And if this fish are looking like they are in a figure of 8, that is also a symbol of eternity. It is perhaps foreshadowing the eventual death that the kamikaze pilot feels that he is on his way to, but chooses to literally avoid, only to lead to a metaphorical death. So I think you've got clever things you can say here, everybody, about the initial enthusiasm of the male character, but all of them end up slightly subtly hinting or perhaps foreshadowing the fact that this initial enthusiasm is only going to lead to a set of circumstances that neither the reader nor the character nor the, as it were, teller of the poem would necessarily want to end up in. And this leads me to the final paragraph, so I would hope, everybody, that you've been able to get about 1.5 pages or so out of writing all of that up, possibly closer to 2 pages. But we get to paragraph 4, and I've slightly hinted on this in paragraph 3, but paragraph 4 should be able to do a similar sort of job. That there is always in both poems an undertone of harmful images, which are always going to prompt loss. So again, I've repeated that key word in the question. An undertone of harmful images in both poems. What I mean by this, everybody, is that there is reference that is implicitly made. It is hinted at. It is only briefly suggested that harm is there as a background presence. Bad things are just brewing in the background. They're never made explicitly obvious. They are only ever implicitly hinted at. What do I mean by this, everybody? This is a really good paragraph that I would hope you could get a lot out of. In Poppies, we hear that she had in line 6 sellotape bandaged around my hand. Now, on one hand, sellotape is a good thing. It fixes things. It binds things together, as it were. And she's using it for a good thing, which is to pick up the cat hair that's on his blazer. But clearly the use of the verb bandaged is something that connotes ideas of physical harm. We have to bandage our leg up if we hurt it. We hear that she wants to get rid of a blockade of yellow bias, a blockade of this loose stitching. That's what I understand yellow bias to mean. But of course, again, a blockade has connotations of war, of blockading a road with tanks, for example. We have that lovely idea of how they were, I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose to play at Eskimos. On one hand, that's very endearing, that's very sweet, that's very lovely, but on the other hand, the use of the verb graze, again, implies physical harm. We hear that the poppy has crimped petals. So on one hand, it's lovely that he's wearing a poppy, and that reminds us of remembrance, but the word crimped suggests slight physical damage. But I think the best thing to talk about, everybody, is the simile at the end, where she leans against the war memorial like a wishbone. So on one hand, this is lovely, she is remembering her son, or at least it's lovely because she is not forgetting him. But on the other hand, what a curious simile, like a wishbone. She is therefore like a wishbone. She is clearly something that is associated with strongly wishing something were the case, and surely in this case, it's that her son is with her. Of course, a wishbone is fragile. A wishbone can very easily break. So you've got there, everybody, a great collection of words. Well, you could analyse each and every single one of those, saying that on one hand, they are generally to do with positive things, but on the other hand, when one considers them further and takes a deeper reading to each one, there is a subtle sense of harm that is not made explicitly obvious, but you just about sense and can see is in the background. And I think we have a similar sort of thing with Kamikaze, where we have lovely, pleasant images, but there's a general hint that all is not well. I've just mentioned earlier, everybody, about the figure of 8. On one hand, that's absolutely beautiful. It's a symbol of eternity. And the idea of fishes coordinatedly being able to do this sounds quite captivating and hypnotic, and an indication of how beautiful nature can be. But on the other hand, the figure of 8 is a symbol of eternity. It is surely foreshadowing or heavily hinting at the fact that somebody may die and then go on to, one rather hopes, an eternal existence in heaven. The idea of the flag waving, the fact that the fish are like a flag waving, rather implies surrender. But the main thing that I ask you to be aware of is just before line 30, we get a magnificent stanza talking about the beauty of the sea, the variety of the sea, and therefore, everybody, the beauty of life, the variety of life. We hear of cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery pink prawns, the silver of whitebait. So on one hand, the grandfather has been able to catch a huge amount of beautiful, varied, colourful examples of nature. But then we get the enjambment break of line 30, and we are suddenly confronted with, bang, a tuna. And anybody who's ever looked up a tuna online or seen one in real life knows that they are not the prettiest and most elegant and beautiful of fishes. They're quite large, ugly, rapid, quick entities that do not necessarily fit in quite well with delicate, beautiful prawns or quite unique crabs or the loose silver of whitebait. And we hear how this tuna is muscular and dangerous. This tuna, surely, everybody, is a metaphor for the sudden introduction of death that can occur into people's lives, and therefore the loss that can happen in people's lives. It sounds quite threatening. It sounds quite, with the description of those adjectives, muscular and dangerous, quite out of place to things that are feathery, like the prawns, or silver, like the whitebait. I hope that makes sense. I think that's a fantastic idea there that I would hope would give you a very, very good paragraph to talk about. Okay, everybody, I really hope that's helpful. As usual, please go through all of those. Any questions, please do let me know. Bye for now.